you. I hit my roadie for the world. Pull up in the range.
All right, Philip, how would you like to discuss Larry Bird and his decision to step down as the president of the Indiana Pacers?
First off, I just want to say that I'm actually a little bit surprised that he did that, what he did. But I mean, at the same time, he's done good things in Indiana. He's done bad things in Indiana. Obviously, he's been a part of the the Indiana Pacer team
Organization.
foundation,
Yeah.
yeah, organization for a long time. I mean, he was a coach in '97, and he won Coach of the Year that very first year in '97. So obviously, his basketball knowledge is not subpar at all. It's elite.
Right.
And so, yeah, usually when you have, former players that are coaches, there's not very many that are very successful. For example, prime example is Magic Johnson. He was a terrible head coach.
Right.
And I think that one of the things of that is that, like, just the transition from a player to a coach, they're so used to doing it themselves. They're not used to people, their learning curve is that much higher than everybody else's. So they obviously think that they can get certain things, the players can get certain things from them. And, obviously they're more talented than, more than half of the
Right.
players that they're coaching now. So,
Right.
I mean, that in itself is just, a deal breaker. But Larry Bird was obviously an exception. Another exception would obviously be Jason Kidd, but that's for another day.
Yeah. Let me put a wrench in that your comment right there, and just to add on to that. And I don't know if you ever noticed, but just how Larry Bird looks on the sideline during games, at least of this last postseason, he definitely was not
Yeah.
as involved.
No.
You could say he that he was feeling differently about how the team was going. And I want to note that you can say a lot of his, not mishaps, but a lot of his questionable decisions as as president of basketball operations. You kind of wonder, he has firing Rick Carlisle was kind of silly to me, early 2000s, and then as soon as Rick Carlisle leaves, he goes to the Mavs and wins a championship. That right there, I know feels like that kind of left a taste in his mouth that he didn't really
That's
like.
true.
And then,
But you know what, Jay?
Yep.
You know what, Jay? Just to put a wrench in what you just said, that same year though, he did win Executive of the Year actually in 2011 and 2012.
okay,
He actually won Executive of the Year, but that also, yeah, firing with Carlisle, that I would definitely agree that that's a very that was a little bit of a mistake that he should have never made. But yeah, he did win Executive of the Year because that was the same year that the Pacers had made it to the Eastern Semis and took the Heat.
yep, and
Who eventually went off to face the Mavs and lost
right.
to 6 games. So yeah, for sure.
See, this 2011 team with Jim O'Brien, who had Frank Vogel as their coach as well, also lost in the Eastern Conference first round, and so it's almost been a trend for them. And then they get to the semis, then they get to the finals, Eastern Conference Finals, 2 years in a row. Then most recently, we watched them lose in the first round twice. So Frank Vogel, the lack of him being on that team, I feel like definitely has an impact. Even though Nate McMillan only went 42 and 40, it still has a big impact on that team. And Paul George, that guy,
Exactly.
there's no way that doesn't have him feeling some type of way about how the future of the team looks. But if we can shift into Paul George, I'd like to talk about just how well, or not how well, but how the relationship between him and Larry Bird really is. After they've been there together for a while now, but it seems as if Larry Bird was sort of unhappy. He had to be unhappy with the play of Paul George.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, it goes back to the fact that Larry Bird himself was a superstar, and he's
Yes.
dealing with a superstar in Paul George.
Mhm.
So they're obviously gonna butt heads as far as egos.
Yep.
I mean, Larry Bird's not gonna let Paul George walk over him, and
Mhm.
Paul George is not gonna let Larry Bird, who he thinks is probably an afterthought at this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
He's
Honestly.
a future NBA superstar.
Mhm.
So why am I gonna let another dude that that played in a completely different era than I did? And
Run me
Paul
over.
George, the way Paul
Yeah.
George is, he probably thinks he's better than Larry Bird,
Yeah.
just like any other competitor. So I mean,
Right.
that's kind of the dilemma between being a former player and then running a team. Like
Yeah.
it,
Yeah,
as
man.
far as the egos clashing, like it's really bad. It's
It's
definitely
real.
really bad.
It's very real
Yep.
because you have to take into account that Paul George has really been the man on that team for the whole time he's been there. You know,
Oh
they
yeah,
had
for
George
seven
Hill,
seasons. Yep.
they had Danny Granger, and they had Roy Hibbert. And
Right here.
the only reason I mentioned those guys, and don't let me forget George Hill if I didn't already say, but those guys were the only people that in the last 4 years that you can say, oh wow, I know that name. Wow, that clicks to me. You know, I actually know who that person is. Everyone else, that Larry Bird and the Pacers organization has pretty much brung in has either been a shell of themselves or has not lived up to the task. Especially
Exactly.
Monte Ellis, he's gotta
Hmm.
you gotta use you know he's gotta be the one to actually be the guy in that city. But he obviously came and his career is falling off as
Yeah,
we move on.
he's starting to, even though he's only 31, but then again, I mean, you have guys who are 31 like LeBron James, like who can continue their high end play, and then you have guys
Yes,
like Monte Ellis who obviously are,
who's just
you would say that they're obviously in their prime years, but they some of them deteriorate and they don't produce as much as they used to.
yeah, right, exactly. And the shots that he takes is always up for question.
Oh,
But
for sure. Yeah.
yeah, we'll shift the focus a little bit to we're gonna try to end this video here fast. But one thing I'd like to say is that the Clippers are very very good right now with the way Chris Paul is playing. Imagine if Paul George was on that roster, what he could do for that team. Real quick, PJ, sum that up
Yeah.
for me.
Man, all right. So you have Paul George and Chris Paul in the backcourt. All right. So you have Paul George. You have okay. Let me back up. All right. So you have Paul George. I wouldn't know who their power forward would be since they would obviously give up Blake Griffin. But then you have DeAndre Jordan and Paul George in the front court. Then you have Chris Paul in the backcourt with someone else obviously with him in the backcourt as well. Maybe JJ Redick, maybe continue to be Jamal Crawford if he stays in the league. But anyways, Paul George and Chris Paul on the floor together would be lethal. Obviously, Chris Paul can take over a game as we know in the clutch as he's been showing us in these playoffs. So you add Paul George, that takes more pressure off Chris Paul. We already all know that Chris Paul is one of the truest point guards this league has ever seen. He's going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer.
Yep.
And with Chris Paul on the floor, Paul George, he's a willing passer. Chris Paul can do it all. He can score, but he's also a willing passer. So Paul, you already know Paul George wants his shots. He's going to get his shots. Then on top of that, DeAndre Jordan doesn't even gets most of his points off rebounds and alley oops. So he doesn't even have to be a part of the offense. So I mean, as far
Yes,
as
sir.
Paul George and Chris Paul getting their touches, it's a done deal. I mean, that would be beautiful.
You're
That would
right.
be a beautiful sight to see.
That right there sums it all up, and that we're gonna leave it on that note. And thanks for watching, and you guys have a nice day. Remember to like and comment and subscribe.
All the way, pull up in the range,